Feld-Weiser one-on-one, where I get to ask Brad some questions, and we'll then bring up the rest of our panelists to offer some more erudition. The phrase I used earlier, I'm going to start with it, is give before you get. That's one of the concepts in the book. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So, if you think about startup communities and how startup communities evolve, there's an ethos that I think is extremely well developed in Boulder, and as I talk to other people in other startup communities and sort of travel around, there's a lot of resonance from entrepreneurs around it, which is this notion of giving before you get. And a lot of people use the phrase pay it forward, and I think they're similar constructs. The best way to explain it is the difference between a mentor and an advisor. And in Boulder, through Techstars and through a number of other activities, this notion of mentorship has really become front and center around the entrepreneurial dynamic. If you think about historically, there were these things called advisors who helped your company. And now we're talking about mentors. The difference between a mentor and advisor is a mentor says, how can I be helpful? And an advisor says, I'd love to help you if you'll give me $5,000 a month. Or if you give me 1% of your company. And so the mentor dynamic is one where you put energy into the system and help other entrepreneurs without really having an expectation of getting anything back. And what generally happens is you get back way more than you ever imagined putting into the system. And I talk about this a fair amount in the book. It's really wired into the ethos of Boulder. So for all of you who are part of it, if you aren't experiencing that in your journey as an entrepreneur in Boulder, send me an email, because I'm curious about that. But if you are, there is never a moment to be too early to be a mentor. So the most powerful mentor relationships are peer relationships, where people are mentoring each other. So it's not that you have to have a whole bunch of experience and a whole bunch of success to be a mentor. You can just start at any point. And the same notion of giving before you get. If you want to participate in the startup community, simply start by contributing something that's unique to you into the overall community.
So this idea, although simple, is also radical because it invites people to take a point of view that is not zero-sum. It's not about you win, you lose. How can people get comfortable with this idea? There are a lot of influences in our culture that are zero-sum, win-lose. You're painting a very different story. How does that work?
So the dynamics of a startup community, and it's important to recognize where startups fit within the overall macroeconomic environment. Lisa's here from Kauffman Foundation. You can probably quote the statistic better than I. It's research that the Kauffman Foundation came up with is that virtually all net new job creation over the last 30 years is from companies that are 5 years old or younger. So if you think about job creation in our country and economic growth, it's coming from very young companies. If you think about the total population that those young companies impact in a particular community, it's relatively small. So the absolute number of people in those companies, when they're starting, is small. The sum of them is non-trivial, and they drive all of the job creation. We have so much room to expand the amount of that activity that the idea that one startup is growing at the expense of another startup is an illogical construct. And if you think about Boulder, as a region, sure, we've got some companies that have some competitive overlap with each other, but not much. And yeah, everybody's competing for talent, but not really. Because Boulder's a very desirable place to be, so we're a pretty good net importer of talent. And in fact, there's good understanding that mobility of talent within a startup community helps the startup community over time. And Silicon Valley is a very good example of that over a very long time period, because companies, people in different companies get different experiences and cross-fertilize. This notion that I win and Phil loses is a dumb notion. And I push it pretty hard. It's pretty easy, interestingly, for most of the entrepreneurs and people that work for startups to get. And then you run into second-order zero-sum problems, like the tension between, for example, startups and real estate. And they're just two parallel universes. Or the dynamics between startups and what they think they need or want, and how government thinks about economic growth. And there are definitely situations where you have zero-sum phenomena going on, but within the startup community, if the startup community in Boulder was 10x the size it was today, you might start bumping into some edges where you had situations where there were trade-offs like that. But we're so far away from that you can play this very non-zero-sum game.
So you've mentioned government, and as you think about economic development as a policy challenge, government will say, well, what can we do? How do we fit in? You articulate some of your thoughts in the book. Could you riff on that a little bit?
So I define in the book something called the Boulder Thesis. So the publisher is Wiley, and Wiley said to me, this is the third book I've done with them. They said, you need a framework. And I said, okay, and I created this four-principle framework. And they said, well, it needs a name. I said, how about the framework? I said, that needs to be better than that. I said, how about the Boulder Thesis? And they said, okay. And that was the end of that. So it's called the Boulder Thesis, which is good branding for all of us as we continue to amplify the message of the magic that's happening here in Boulder around us. I'm going to just list off the four principles quickly that the sort of whole theory around startup communities is built around. They are, first, that the startup community has to be led by entrepreneurs. Second, those entrepreneurs have to take a very long-term view, 20-plus year view. Third, you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level in the startup community. And fourth, there have to be activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack that are happening on a continual basis in the startup community. So those are the four principles. There's a magnificent thing that Kaufman did called, in their sketchbook series around this, called Startupville. Phil's questions about government. I separate the constituents in the startup community into two categories, leaders and feeders. Leaders are the entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial-led. Feeders are everyone else. Now, both leaders and feeders are critically important to the startup community. So it's not that leaders are better than feeders or feeders are different, or worse, they're different. People who are participants or members of a feeder organization can play a leadership role. But the absence of a critical mass of leaders will mean that you won't make any progress as a startup community. And that critical mass of leaders doesn't have to be every entrepreneur. If I think back to when I moved here and got started to get involved in the startup community in the mid-90s, there were probably a dozen people that I put in that kind of a leadership role. I see Tom is front and center. Tom Higley would be an example. Tim Enwell would be an example. Paul Bavarian would be an example. Right? These are people who are entrepreneurs who are building their companies, but also wanted to participate and engage in the creation of the startup community. The feeders are everybody else, so government, university, big business, venture capitalists, angel investors, lawyers, accountants. All of these feeders play a very, very important role. But it really comes down to this distinction between a network and a hierarchy. So think about a hierarchy. Since the shift from the agricultural society to industrial society at the turn of the century, which then continued through World War I and World War II and really accelerated sort of into the 1960s and 1970s, hierarchies were created to create efficiency in communication and leverage within an organization. And if you think about hierarchies, have a bunch of people at the bottom and builds up, and there's a boss at the top. And government's a hierarchy, military's a hierarchy. Hierarchy's not a new construct. Religion's a hierarchy, right? For some people, Jesus is at the top of the hierarchy. Inside Jewish joke. But we have these institutional hierarchies, and if you think about organizations today, government functions as a hierarchy, big business functions as a hierarchy, university functions mostly as a hierarchy with some weird twists because of the tension between professors and the power that professors have in the university infrastructure.
It doesn't feel that way as a dean.
Often feels like a brutal, oppressive hierarchy.
No, it's more of a network because at a university you can't make your professors do anything.
How much money do you have to pay to get a parking pass? I want a parking pass for that parking lot. How much? $10,000?
I know someone believes that joke. We did buy the bathroom back there. Feld bathroom. I check it all out.